Vietnam was the first helicopter war, and the first war watched live on TV. America entered to stop communism from swallowing South Vietnam. But this war mutated fast from guerrillas into a full-scale fight, with gunships overhead and hovercraft cutting through the river deltas. Yet, even with all that power, America still lost. Even the bombings B-52s included couldn't break the North Vietnamese army. And they kept coming, until Saigon fell. For civilians, the war never started. It was always there. For Vietnam, this wasn't a single war. It was 30 years of fire. Starting in 1945, a nationalist Marxist movement, the Viet Minh, began fighting to end French rule across Indochina to block Viet Minh influence spreading through Laos. France chose to fortify a remote valley village, Dien Bien Phu. It was the war's fatal mistake. For Viet Minh divisions encircled it, French strongpoints collapsing like dominoes, and France surrendered not just the base, but Indochina itself. They picked the valley for easy resupply by air. Dien Bien Phu was seized by French paratroopers, colonial and airborne units in November 1953. From here, they planned to preempt the spring offensive, sending long-range patrols into Laos. They dug in, confident they were out of Viet Minh artillery Renjivan from the surrounding mountains. But while supply drops fell, the Viet Minh received Chinese long-range guns. Freed up after Korea, now they had the reach and the perfect chance to force a set-piece battle and crush France. Under General de Castries, the garrison discovered the truth. This wasn't roaming patrol warfare. It was a siege, and even air power would fail them. From the hills, Chinese 105mm guns hammered French positions non-stop. Infantry dug trenches closer and closer until the final human wave assaults ended it. It was World War I siege warfare used to avoid the slaughter of open ground attacks. France surrendered not just the fortress, but its entire Indochina empire. Geneva split Vietnam in two, a fragile south under Bao Dai, and a communist north ruled by Ho Chi Minh. North Vietnam regrouped behind the demilitarized zone and poured support into Viet Cong guerrillas through the 1960s. America feared a replay of Dien Bien Phu that southeast Asia would fall like dominoes. To stiffen ARVN resistance, the U.S. sent 33 helicopters H-21s, already nearly obsolete, but they introduced air mobility, a turning point. The war would never be the same. But a war VN used them poorly, often refusing to jump from hovering aircraft and when they landed, they hesitated, becoming easy targets for forces on the ground. South Vietnam struggled to contain a growing guerrilla army that kept gaining strength. Operations like Morning Star often failed to few Viet Cong killed, or no contact at all. Many Americans concluded ARVN was poorly trained and poorly led. Alongside helicopters, America launched Operation Ranch, hand-spraying Agent Orange to strip jungle cover. They called it modern denial. It's a technological solution to a human problem. Over 9 years, millions of gallons were dropped. The ground suffered, but the guerrillas still found ways to hide. America tried relocation for strategic hamlets, the third arm of policy, pacification. It began with Operation Sunrise. Villagers airlifted into fortified settlements with only what they could carry. Villages built to be guarded and controlled. To peasants distrustful of officials, it felt less like protection and more like a cage. The program began collapsing politically and militarily. Even strong fortifications couldn't stop propaganda. With 23,000 advisors in South Vietnam, America hovered on the edge of full war. Then came the incident. Maddox reportedly attacked off North Vietnam, no damage. But a torpedo boat was sunk. Gunfire. Retribution followed, carrier decks launching strikes from Constellation. Admiral Moore ordered attacks. phantoms and crusaders hitting naval bases. Back home, Congress handed Johnson's sweeping powers a blank check for war. In Vietnam, GIAP raised the stakes. Regular North Vietnamese units crossed the DMZ. This wasn't infiltration anymore. It was invasion. America answered with B-52 strikes from Guam. Then Marines landed at Da Nang. A full brigade came ashore. The 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, 3,500 men. With them came tanks. And the strange Ontu's anti-tank Vehicle 6 recoilless rifles, later used in Hue, one of the war's decisive battles. The landing took 4 days. Meanwhile, artillery cleared the road to South Vietnam's second city, Da Nang. At this stage, America aimed to carve out a safe enclave to support ARVN and counterinsurgency operations. But terrain turned everything into slow pain. Progress was brutal and made perfect targets for snipers. Then came rolling thunder. Strategic bombing meant to choke. North Vietnam's buildup north of the DMZ. Only after 2 years did Hanoi become a target. B-52s carried an 84,000-pound payload. But Roots' exposed raids to foreign air control secrecy evaporated. Politics and strategy clashed, and Rolling Thunder would be judged a failure. North Vietnamese movement into the south surged, numbers swelling within months. They built up especially to defend the Central Highlands, nearing 250,000 underarms. ARVN setbacks helped kill pacification. Westmoreland chose attrition operation. Kickoff and 3 years of search and destroy followed. The Pentagon believed it was pushing communists toward collapse. But it locked America into a ground war in Asia. 1966 brought large-scale missions. Operation Masher aimed to crush insurgency near Bong Son, while another targeted the Iron Triangle, a stronghold on the Vietnam-Laos-Cambodia borders. Masher was launched by 1st Cavalry Airmobile. But Johnson forced a rename White Wing, fearing the original sounded too brutal. Helicopters changed the rules, and GIAP initially underestimated them. His troops were surprised. Casualties were heavy, but American intelligence was often wrong, especially about enemy strength. Sometimes sweeps found nothing, empty positions. The enemy vanished because guerrillas win if they don't lose, while conventional armies lose if they don't win. That's the trap when contact happened. Infantry moved in from platoon size to battalion strength, but real fights erupted only when the enemy chose ambush or got cornered. Platoon leaders deployed while distant positions were shelled from fire bases deep in the rear. Then came the pylon, units closing in to trap enemy forces. But an elusive enemy made us firepower bleed into the jungle. Armor moved up to shield advances. Extra machine guns turned carriers into assault vehicles. Armored cavalry built for impact. Their adaptation surprised even Westmoreland, but operations meant to win hearts often did the opposite. They pushed people toward the Viet Cong after artillery. Infantry was airlifted forward, but often the enemy rose from cover, unscathed. To destroy them, you had to find them, pin them down, and survive the contact. Frustrated by an invisible enemy, America turned to numbers, body counts, prisoners. Suspects as if statistics could win a war. By mid-1967, they claimed a crossover point. Enemy losses exceeding recruitment. But chasing big numbers created pressure and drove costly attacks. Like Hamburger Hill, helicopters dropped troops behind lines, including Special Forces Green Berets. Communists lured Americans into prepared kill zones, camouflage trenches, bunkers deep, hidden, deadly. Experienced officers learned one rule: don't attack what you don't understand. Instead, fall back and call artillery. Or airstrikes. Though hit again and again, improvised pontoons kept supplies moving. Long truck columns pushed through crowds. Repairs were labor-heavy, draining people from other critical work. Further south, supplies fed the most famous route of the war, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, sometimes mud. Sometimes were always the lifeline from north to south. Always moving. After monsoon, main force units built up in the south, triggering airstrikes on traffic. America didn't see it, but this was the prologue to Tet. Targets were hit with precision, but the buildup continued. Incursions surged into the Central Highlands, ending in brutal fights like Dak II. Outnumbered, Americans answered with sustained airstrikes. Reinforcements were airlifted in 3 weeks of fighting. Nearly 300 Americans dead. North Vietnamese losses more than 5 times higher. But those attacks were diversions, designed to pull Americans away from the cities targeted in Tet. Tet was North Vietnam's gamble, a surprise offensive counting on uprising. Viet Cong divisions spearheaded assaults from springboards along the trail. They hit Khe Sanh, Hue, Saigon, and provincial capitals across the map. The Saigon attacks shocked the world, proving they could strike at the heart of U.S. influence. The embassy? A suicide squad entered the compound, and TV broadcast the shock. America had been lulled into believing a major attack was impossible. Tet turned defeat into psychological victory. Some ran a gauntlet of attacks just beyond the airfield perimeter. Supplies forced in by any means. The Khe Sanh siege was smashed by Operation Niagara Strikes. Then the siege ended as strangely as it began. Giap pulled forces back after overcommitting to a diversion, fearing escalation, even a tactical nuclear strike. If 6,000 Marines were captured, America might do the unthinkable. Soon after, the U.S. abandoned it to Dot at My Lay. Search and destroy found no guerrillas and became a massacre of civilians, men, women, children. In America, the impact was immediate. Anti-war protests surged. Within 2 weeks, Johnson stepped away from re-election. Battlefield gains were reversed by collapsing public confidence. Morale fell. The 12-month rotation system prevented combat experience from accumulating a constant reset. Drug abuse and indiscipline surged as opposition at home grew. Withdrawals began. After Tet, communist forces regrouped, concentrating in the Mekong. From now on, the war would shift toward conventional fighting once logistics were ready. That took years, while counterinsurgency dragged on. By 1972, Vietnamization dominated. ARVN pushed forward as Americans pulled back. Communists tested it with the Easter Offensive even as peace talks ran. Along South Vietnamese convoy prepared to retake territory at an LOC. U.S. ground forces were down to 24,000 from half, 1 million after Tet. Most were advisors, often effectively leading ARVN in desperate fights. Communist positions were hammered relentlessly, but ARVN morale was uneven. Some fled with their families. For the last time, American firepower saved them. Cobra gunships with cannons and rockets shredded. Infiltration attempts. The offensive aimed to seize territory where communists had built support. But it collapsed under carpet bombing by B-52s. Over 100 750-pound bombs broke. Assaults and formations, one of America's most effective tools. Giap learned again. You can't ignore weapons you don't have. Air supremacy mattered, but only temporarily. Time was still running. North Vietnam regrouped for 2 years after Americans left. Then the final invasion began, a push designed to split the South. Attacks on Hue, Con, Tum, and Da Nang threw the South into chaos, and communist forces swept toward Saigon. April 1975, 2 years earlier. North Vietnam showcased SAM missiles weapons built to change the sky. Giap's army had transformed, now fielding Russian T-54 tanks. 30 years earlier, they were peasants with rifles. Now they were trained across land and sky. Their leadership and morale stood in sharp contrast to the South. Confused by contradictory orders, rushing guns north in panic. Refugees signaled what was coming. Many howitzers never reached their targets, bogged down in civilian chaos. Some were only delayed, but farther north. Shelling killed hundreds. The final major battle before Saigon was Juan Lo Can epic artillery duel. One South Vietnamese division held off 3 for 2 weeks. But panic redeployments broke the rear. Tens of thousands fled, blocking reinforcements. Political interference exposed ARVN weakness at the worst moment possible. Collapse came fast. Soldiers and civilians crammed onto any boat leaving Saigon. North Vietnamese regulars entered the capital on April 30, 1975. They didn't defeat the American soldier in every battle. But the North had something the South lacked: tenacity. And the South had what destroys wars from inside: corruption and collapsing will. Even with America behind them, they couldn't match the North's drive. The lesson was brutal. To win a revolutionary war, you need political will, not just firepower.